Tassie. My English name is Leonard Flett, more commonly known as Len, and my spirit name is Kitchenuhmaykoosib. I want to thank my good friend Carl Stone for inviting me to speak on an elder's perspective on change. There have been many changes in our society that I have witnessed in my lifetime, but I want to focus on the movement of our people from the reserves into towns and cities. The mass migration beginning in the mid-50s and early 60s brought about many profound changes to our communities. Before I get too far into my presentation, I want to let you know that I have IPF, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It means I have fibers growing in my lungs, infected areas that become dry and leather-like. I easily become short of breath, and certainly with any physical activity, and when I speak for an extended period of time. I am not in any pain, so don't worry if during the course of my talk I take some extra time to catch my breath. I was born in Manitoba, Manitoba, almost 80 years ago, to a Cree man who was a fur trader with the Hudson's Bay Company. And my mother was the youngest daughter of Chief Sampson Beardy, who signed the adhesion to Treaty Number 9 in Northern Ontario, committing his people and territory to Canada. Because of my grandfather, I have a strong and deep interest in our treaties. My father was transferred to Little Duck Lake, Manitoba in the late 40s. Little Duck Lake was a Denny community located inland northeast of Churchill and close to the Nunavut border. It was the traditional home of the Saisi Denny, who now live in the Dooley Lake. What is tragic about the Saisi Denny story was the forced relocation of the people to Churchill by a government that had decided that they were killing too many caribou. They were promised better lives than Churchill's, but it was all lies. I came face to face with racism and political incompetence and political cruelty at an early age. Of the 250 people relocated in 1956, only 117 were still alive by 1973 when they began relocating themselves back to their traditional area in defiance of the authorities. Some that died were my childhood friends. Can you believe that? My own childhood friends. My family, including me, were on the last flight out of the community in 1956. I wrote a biographical book about my life a few years ago entitled From the Barren Lands. The book cover features a picture of me and my siblings in Little Duck Lake. We are all dressed in caribou hide clothing that my mother had sewn for us. The book, which is about the fur trade and the First Nations, is still available at McNally Robinson. From Little Duck Lake, our family moved to South End, Saskatchewan, and then finally settled in Cumberland House. I call Cumberland House home because that is where my parents and other family members are buried. Like Chief Crazy Horse said, my lands are where my people are buried. When I graduated from high school in Prince Albert in 1962, there were only 2 of us who were First Nation students in that school. Prince Albert was mostly white, as were most Canadian cities, including Winnipeg. There were few Indigenous organizations, no Indigenous businesses, no Indigenous services. I didn't see any Indigenous faces working in the banks, restaurants, hotels, stores, hospitals, or any other places of employment. What we need to remember is that for almost 80 years, the Indian Act prevented our people from leaving their reserves. The Indian Act was revised in 1951 that included lifting the restriction that confined our people. Even so, it took some time for our people to realize that they were free to come and go. And even though some left, it would be almost another decade before our people began migrating into towns and cities in big numbers in search of better lives. Today, Prince Albert is a small city of around 40,000, with the Indigenous population making up over 35% of the total. There are numerous Indigenous organizations there and businesses, including 3 urban reserves within the city, and Indigenous employment is evident in all sectors. The migration of our people into urban areas began in the mid-50s. I tracked the movement of our people by the numbers of friendship centers that were available. In the mid-50s, there were 3, Toronto, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. By the 1960s, there were 26 across the country. Our people were now on the move. Then there were 40 in the 1970s, 80 friendship centers in the 1980s, and 114 in the 90s. And as of 2020, there are 118. So it appears that the mass migration peaked around the turn of the century. 70 years later, as of today, over half of the First Nation people live off reserve. Many in the major cities, many in the major cities across the country. The mass migration has not been without its problems. Indigenous people make up 5% of Canada's population, and yet they make up 27% of the prison population. In the western provinces, the Indigenous incarceration rate of 50 to 80% is atrocious. Prior to the 1960s and prior to the migration into towns and cities, the incarceration rate was only 1 to 2% across the entire country. Of course, being confined to the reserve by the Indian Act was also already a form of incarceration. It angers me today that here in Winnipeg, just last month in April, 3 of our people, including a 16-year-old girl, have been gunned down by police. In 2018, according to a CBC investigation report, 60% of deaths caused by police shootings involved Indigenous victims. 60%. When I was a young man, it was never like this. Back then, I was always shocked by news of black people in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama being mistreated and murdered by their white police. But I never thought that one day our own people would start to be treated in the same way by our own police. Because May the 5th was Red Dress Day, I looked at the stats provided by the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, and I noticed that the number of cases in the 50s and 60s were just a handful. Moving in tandem with the Indigenous migration, there was a noticeable increase in the 70s, and then the numbers began to explode in the 80s and 90s and continues to increase into the 2000s. Many of our people were unprepared for life outside the reserves. Many were uneducated or undereducated, untrained and inexperienced. Many became homeless, sleeping in doorways, alleys, back alleys, and in parks and under bridges. Many were addicted and had no choice but to fall into criminal activity just to survive. That is not to say that we were all like that. Let me make it clear. Most of our people who migrated have successfully integrated and become law-abiding and contributing citizens. However, a major problem, like an oozing sore that refuses to heal, does exist. Many of our western cities and towns that have one or more reserves nearby have been identified by Maclean's magazine as some of the most dangerous places to live in Canada. In fact, Thompson has been identified 3 years in a row as the most dangerous community to live in Canada. And of course, Thompson serves many Indigenous communities in the area. Automatically, people assume and may tend to respond by pointing a finger at us and as being the main problem, and respond by building more jails and hiring more police. However, it is extreme poverty, not race, which is at the root of criminal activity. Unfortunately, many of our people were and are still mired in poverty. A 2014 United Nations report stated that of the poorest 100 communities in Canada, 96 were First Nation communities. We remain the poorest of the poor in one of the richest countries in the world. We have become beggars in our own land, and sadly, as evidenced by the incarceration rates and police killings, we are viewed by many of the rest of society through jaundiced lenses. Being confined to our reserves for almost 100 years and shut out of the economy and development of our country, subjected to the abuses of residential schools, subjected as a target of genocidal and assimilative policies, have left many of our people reeling from trauma. If there is any finger pointing to be done, it has to be in the direction of our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who built Canada on the backs of the First Nations with his failed Indigenous policies. Now, there are solutions to these issues. In my opinion, they start with the treaties. Reconciliation cannot be possible without addressing our treaties, because our treaties are the agreements between Canada and the First Nations that made settlement possible. Our treaties form the backbone of Canada's founding. Now, Canada can continue to resolve individual Indigenous issues whenever disagreements break out that result in disruption to our economy through road and rail blocks. Canada can continue to accommodate and resolve to some degree most protests First Nation by First Nation. However, in the long run, until our treaties are honored, our people will continue to harbor bitterness and feel that the original settler Canadians and their descendants are thieves of our land. And that is not fair to the descendants nor to us. Our treaties, for the most part, were left to languish and become outdated once Canada had access to our lands. The Indian Act was unilaterally developed and implemented in 1876 without First Nation input. This act usurped the powers of the treaties and became a legal instrument by which First Nations lives were and are still controlled and oppressed. The Indian Act needs to be repealed and our attention refocused on correcting and updating our treaties. It is incomprehensible to believe that the existing treaty documents are able to withstand the scrutiny of our courts given the one-sided nature of the agreements, the coercion, including the politics of starvation involved in forcing some of the chiefs to sign them, and the questionable interpreting that took place. Most of the major Indigenous issues that Canada has had to deal with, where lives were lost and our economies greatly disrupted, were over land disputes. Now, it is incomprehensible that lands were distributed to reserves without provisions for lands required for future population growth. And I don't believe for a minute that the chiefs understood that the lands being set aside as reserves for the bands were lands held in trust for the First Nations, with the actual ownership vested in the Crown. We don't even own our own reserve lands. 60 years ago, when I was a young man, the reserves that I worked in or visited were all relatively small, and yet there was lots of room. But over the years, these reserves have exploded in size with airports, roads, new schools, band offices, nursing stations, stores and other businesses, and many more new homes built, some with water and sewer lines installed. Now, most of the inhabitable lands has been quickly used up. Today, those same reserves are struggling for land on which to put more housing because of overcrowding and because so much of the land initially set out for the reserves consisted of swamp, rock, and muskeg. Many First Nations still have outstanding land claims, and yet Canada continues to drag its feet in providing settlement. Urban reserves continue to be opposed, and yet they are proving to be an essential part of our future. The other major issue is our treaty payments. It is incomprehensible that treaty payments were set without future adjustments for inflation. The $4 or $5 annual payment that was set at the time of treaty making meant a lot for our people. It was of some value then because it purchased a fair amount of goods necessary for our people. Today, the same treaty payment barely buys a loaf of bread, yet the value of the lands that were involved in return for the treaty payments increased many folds since then. In fact, farmland that was available for $1 an acre during the treaty making period now sells on a very rough average at around $5,000 per acre. And based on present values of farmlands, it has been suggested that treaty payments should be in the range of $5,000 per year. Bringing treaty payments up to present value today would eliminate the poverty in which so many of our people find themselves so hopelessly stuck. Eliminating poverty would be a major factor in reducing crime and all of its subsequent costs in policing and incarceration. It would greatly assist the people who live on remote reserves that can barely eke out a subsistence living due to the extreme high cost of having to fly all goods into their communities at great expense. It would also inject much needed funds to encourage business development and employment on all reserves, including the remote ones, making these locations more livable for those people that choose to continue to live there. Respect and pride would also be restored for many. Graduation from grade 12 in my time was a rare event. I don't know how many Indigenous kids graduated from high school back then. Not many, that's for sure. I do know that in 1960, there were only about 60 First Nation students registered in post-secondary studies across the entire country. Today, there are tens of thousands. Today, I am impressed by our young people who recognize that education is paramount to advancement. I am impressed by the educational qualifications of our young people who are stepping into the crucial roles of leadership. I am also impressed by the many mainstream Canadians, young and old, who have educated themselves on Indigenous issues. More so than ever before, it warmed my heart to see so many of them protesting alongside our people in support of justice for the Wet'suwet'en. I have hope that real communication can and will take place, and that true reconciliation will come about as a result at some point in the future. I have no doubt that our young people will bridge the chasm of doubt and suspicion that keep us apart politically, and therefore help to reshape an inclusive confederation that we can all proudly call our Canada. I am proud to be a Canadian, but I am not an immigrant. I will not be assimilated, and I will not be legislated out of existence. This is our original home. I think that I can speak for our people when I say all we want is justice, respect, and a fair share of what is due to us. Ikose, miigwech, masicho. Thank you for listening to me.